On January 28th, the US dollar fell to its lowest level since the beginning of 2022. Bloomberg notes that the sharp drop occurred due to Donald Trump's remarks about the devaluation of the US currency. This is an excellent result for business. A massive sell-off of dollars began on the currency markets. As a result, the euro exceeded the mark of $1.20 for the first time since 2021. Petro Oleszczuk, political scientist and lecturer at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. He is joining us live. Petro, welcome.
Yes.
Welcome. Such a drop in the dollar and simultaneous rise of the euro is causing concern in the European Union. Why is that? What are they dissatisfied with?
Well, I think once again, this is primarily related to the exchange rate difference, which directly affects the overall financial outcome. Industry for export, that is, it's no secret to anyone. It is certainly no secret that certain nations specializing in exports deliberately maintain their national currency exchange rate at a somewhat lower level in order to gain a competitive advantage from the exchange rate difference. That is why the situation is far more complex and nuanced in international relations. For example, if the national currency depreciates relative to other currencies, this is by no means always a bad thing for the economy. And conversely, if it strengthens, that doesn't always mean something good.
Let's leave this topic to economists who specialize in international economics. They can explain it to us in more detail. But with you, let's talk about, among other things, the relationship between Europe and the United States. NATO needs to be rethought, and European countries must significantly increase their defense capabilities. This opinion was expressed by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He stated that the alliance should not change its goal, but rather enhance its capabilities. Therefore, European partners need to invest more in defense so as not to rely on support from Washington. This point has been made by American partners for an entire year now, and last year they spoke about it at the Munich Security Conference. In various formulations, sometimes harsher ones, Marco Rubio usually uses softer wording. But we can see that Europe has already become more active, is ramping up production, and is changing its approaches. Is it enough?
I believe that probably it is simply not quite sufficient if there are still unanswered questions about defense capability and about everything that, for example, directly affects this defense capability. That is, on the one hand, of course, according to formal criteria, the steady increase in capital investments by European countries in their own defense looks quite significant, especially if you compare it directly to the figures from 2022. Back when European defense was generally in a neglected state. But, well, probably it's not enough. Probably all of this still needs to be developed. Again, it is necessary not only to focus on building up potential, but most importantly, not to be afraid to use that potential appropriately when it is needed. For example, France recently demonstrated an appropriate result when it successfully seized tanks from Russia's Shadow Fleet. If other European countries had supported this collective action, it would have already impacted Russia's ability to carry out further aggression. That is, as Ukraine has shown, for example, with successful SBU special operations against Russian Shadow Fleet tankers in the Black Sea, which we observed as early as last year. In fact, all of this needs to be expanded and supported, and for example, if Russia is deprived of the ability to earn money. On exporting oil, well, that would already provide the necessary opportunities, for example. The danger to Europe from Russia would be reduced. Because when we talk, for example, about Europe's defense capability, we are talking about its defense capability. Well, obviously the biggest and most real threat to Europe is Russia, which regularly makes claims against European Union countries such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and Finland. These countries are direct neighbors of Russia. Accordingly, it is necessary not only to think about increasing military potential, but also to ensure that this potential meets modern requirements. That's the first point. And secondly, that the Russians understand there is the political will to use it at the appropriate moment should the need arise. And here, in any case, Europeans need to work closely with Ukraine because any European architecture will not be viable without Ukraine's participation.
Well, regarding security architecture, Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff and the American president's advisor Jared Kushner will not participate in the new round of negotiations in the Emirates. They will be bilateral between Ukraine and Russia, reported U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He said security guarantees for Ukraine between Washington and Kyiv are agreed, but they need to be approved by Russia. He did not add anything further. The most difficult issue in the negotiations remains the territorial question. Petro, in your opinion, why are the United States essentially stepping back from this stage of negotiations?
Well, to be honest, it's hard for me to say because I don't know how these negotiations are taking place, and no one does except for the participants themselves. Perhaps in this situation, the United States believes that they have fulfilled their mission, and now, as they say, there's nothing more they can add. Although, in my opinion, that's quite a questionable approach. It's a rather dubious approach. In any case, everything will ultimately come down to the United States. Why? Because Russia has consistently shown in the past, and continues to show now, that it does not respect the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. But it obviously does respect the sovereignty of the United States. In other words, any agreements cannot be made without the participation of the United States. As a participant, guarantor, mediator, and the one who will directly take responsibility for implementing these agreements. So, again, it's hard for me to imagine what they will even talk about there. How they are going to discuss all of this. But in any case, the participation of the United States at the final stage is still inevitable, because without the participation of the United States, none of this will make any sense. And in fact, without the participation of the United States, people could talk as much as they want. But the point is, how can we ensure that these agreements are actually implemented?
What I find interesting is the nuance that Ukraine says, we will sign an agreement with the United States, and then the United States will have a separate track to talk with Russia. But at the same time, Marco Rubio says that the security guarantees have been agreed upon, but Russia still has to consent to them. So what is the value of the agreements we are supposed to sign with the United States if Russia hasn't agreed to them yet? Will the United States wait for Russia's approval on every single point?
I can't answer that question for you because I don't quite understand the logic of American diplomacy in this particular situation. But I do understand that in principle, if you wait for the Russians to agree to every relevant point, it's unlikely you'll ever get anywhere. Because the Russians will consistently reject everything. For example, we know that the Russians reject the idea of deploying European peacekeepers on Ukrainian territory. They say that there should be no military contingents from any countries. NATO, we're against it. But obviously, this is one of the fundamental principles of future security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, in principle, if I were in the place of the United States and Western partners, I would simply present Russia with a fait accompli. This is the only type of relationship with Russia that is adequate. And in fact, as the situation shows, even with, for example, those Russian tankers, when Russia is presented with a fait accompli and Russia understands that, any response would mean a large-scale conflict with someone stronger than Russia itself, so Russia backs down. That is, they silently swallowed it when the Americans seized a tanker under the Russian flag, pretending that nothing had happened. Similarly, for example, if after a hypothetical agreement is reached, some NATO troops land on Ukrainian territory, the Russians might express outrage. Or they might simply pretend that nothing happened at all. Because if you get outraged and do nothing, you look weak. That's why diplomacy with Russia is a bit different. Unfortunately, Europeans don't understand that diplomacy with Russia is not the same as, for example, diplomacy between Denmark and the United States, or say between France and the United States, between countries that are used to adhering to certain principles. Diplomacy with Russia is something fundamentally different. Because Russia recognizes only the condition of strength and the balance of power. If it senses strength, it is ready to talk to someone accordingly. If it perceives weakness, it will continually try to push someone around.
Petro, thank you. Petro Oleszczuk, political scientist and lecturer at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, was with us on the air.